Good afternoon and welcome to the first of the Farnham Castle Intercultural Training webinar series for 2013. My name is Laura Mayo and I work as the Business Development Manager here within the Intercultural Training team. Supporting today's webinar, we've also got Matthew McLachlan on the line from an IT support perspective. And we've also got joining us Caroline Gregory, who will be presenting at the main session. So before we actually start the webinar, what I'd like to do is just take you through some general housekeeping. So hopefully up on your screen now you'll see a couple of points just outlining some general housekeeping rules. What we've done is we've muted all the microphones just so we can make sure that we keep the lines clear. But what we will do is activate the question box in order for you to communicate with myself, Matthew and also Caroline, who is presenting this webinar. What we'd like to do is keep the questions held till the end when we will open the floor to a Q&A session. Obviously, if there are urgent questions that come up, we will be reviewing them as we go through, so we can certainly pull those questions out. If you do have any technical problems in terms of viewing the slides or sound, then please contact Matthew and we've got a troubleshooting line here for you. So in terms of making sure everybody's set up for the webinar, what I'd like to do is just highlight to you where the chat box is, just for those who aren't comfortable with the WebEx system. So down in the bottom corner here, you'll see the option to send a question to. You can pull down on that menu and select the host or the host and presenter for specific questions. And then in the box underneath, you can simply write in your questions and send that to the target group. Up in the top left-hand corner, where I'm just highlighting now, you'll see an arrow. During the webinar, you may find that Caroline will request your views. Basically, if you want to use your pointer and highlight a specific area on a slide, you can use your pointer to do that. So from here onwards, what I'll do is I'll pass you over to Caroline, who will take you through the main session.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. I need control of the slides. There we are. I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see me, and I hope that continues for the next 30 minutes. I thought you'd like to know where we are. I know you've logged in from different places. We're in Farnham in Surrey. My two colleagues, Laura and Matthew, are actually in the castle. This is an overhead view. I'm not in the castle at the moment. I'm actually nearer to Farnham ponds. You'll see here in the picture. The ponds were actually dug out by the Bishop of Winchester, one of the bishops, to supply fish for the castle. If you know anything of the history of Farnham Castle. That is actually our weather today. I think we're further south than most of you, and the sun is out. This is the agenda for today, which I think you've all had. Obviously, our time is limited, but that's what we're going to be covering. And I would like to reiterate, if you do have a question that relates to the contents, please do type it in and I will try and cover it, and if not, cover it at the end. So who am I? My name's Caroline Gregory. I've been an intercultural trainer for nearly 20 years, and I've helped thousands of people over that time. Here are some of them in a group. They've come from all over the world, and I've tried always to understand them as individuals with their own lives, families, friends, and of course worries, because moving countries is one thing, working with different people is another, but you still have your personal life, your private life. Global mobility, of course, has changed the workplace in a stunning way, and I think most people would agree will continue to do that. And of course, UK population growth is driven by immigration at the moment. Most companies, therefore, have employees from multiple cultures, ethnic groups, nationalities, a combination of these. The pluses, I think, are that we're constantly gaining new skills, not just in particular areas, but overall. Different things are coming into the culture. New ideas are coming in, and of course it can affect cost. But it's nearly always hard work, not just for the people who are moving, but for the people who are supporting them and the families behind that. And sometimes it isn't smooth. I think perhaps some of you would say that that's putting something in a very gentle way, when actually there can be big problems. Culture shock is talked about a lot, and I think often it's confused with other things. I feel that culture shock is not what has happened to this poor person in the picture. It's not tiredness, chaos, and a very steep learning curve you have when you move. Because, of course, everybody at some point in their life buys a new car, changes doctor, moves house, etc. The difficulty is when you're moving, you tend to do them all within a very, very short period of time. But I don't feel that's culture shock. I feel that's the tiredness with the initial move, and that does wear off after a couple of months. I also don't feel that culture shock is the same thing as homesickness. Again, homesickness is something which can be clearly defined. So homesickness is when you want a person, a certain place, a smell perhaps that reminds you of home, or a favourite taste, something that's perhaps very evocative of childhood or again of family. The picture in the bottom, those are fresh mangoes, if anybody has that as a question. A sensation is also something of homesickness, just something that makes you feel familiar. A lot of people who move countries say that even looking out of the window is not familiar. It's not what they're expecting. It's not comfortable. So what is culture shock? A lot of people describe it as it's looking in a fairground mirror. You recognise what you see, but the detail isn't clear. And of course, in most situations, as an adult, not as a young child, but as an adult, the detail is what we need and what we want. Culture shock is, most adults are aware that in any society, in any culture, there are lots of rules. But culture shock happens when you're not quite sure what the rules are, and you do know you've broken some by people's reactions. And of course, in general, people don't talk about the rule breaking because they assume it's making a personal comment or it's something that's personal. It's not a cultural difference. I'll give you a quote here which I like about culture shock. Culture shock is what happens when a traveller suddenly finds himself in a place where yes may mean no, where a fixed price is negotiable, where to be kept waiting in an outer office is no cause for insult, and where laughter may signify anger. I like that one because, again, it refers to the intangible things, not the tangible. There are lots of things which happen when you move that may irritate you, to do with climate, infrastructure, are two good examples. But you know what you're dealing with. And even if you don't like those things from your first day until your last day, you know what you're dealing with. Culture shock, I think, refers to the intangible things, the things you're not quite sure about, and the things you can't ask about easily. I've got a question for you now. Now, of course, I'm generalizing here and I'm not giving you context. And if you had your mics on, I'm sure in answer to that question, you'd all say, well, it depends. Is it in the building I work in? Is it somebody I've worked with for years? Is it somebody from a different division or department? But just keep it general. So when you meet a colleague in the corridor, so you're walking one way, they're walking the other, what do you do in general? Do you walk past them? Do you nod and keep walking? Do you ask them how they are but keep walking? Do you pause briefly and discuss the weather or something equally simple? Do you stop and chat? Do you stop and have a conversation? Or do you touch and talk? And by that I mean, do you shake hands, do you kiss, and then speak? If you know how to use them, could you put your arrow next to the one that you, in general, would feel is for you? Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Linda. I'll just wait a moment while a few more arrows come up. Okay. A lot of people are grouping towards the top there, and of course, if we had more time, this would be an interesting thing to discuss. But in general, if you meet somebody in the corridor and they, looking at the answers from A to G, they react in the way you expect, you are immediately comfortable. There's still some names coming in near the top. And one question I'm asked a lot by people who are coming to live and work in Britain is, why do my colleagues ignore me in the corridor? We might have had a very good conversation in a meeting or at lunch or even socially, and yet in the corridor they don't really respond to me. Most people then work out that perhaps they've done something. I'm going to move on from that one if everyone's seen it. So to me, this is something that has nothing to do with manners or etiquette. This is cultural, and it is often small things like this that can make somebody feel quite uncomfortable, because they then perhaps continue on and go to a meeting all the time thinking, what have I done? What haven't I handled correctly? When in fact all it is something cultural. Because again, most of you are grouping at the top here. You're going to nod or grunt or do something like that and keep walking. Therefore, if somebody stops, bars your way, shakes hands, kisses, asks you how your weekend was, how your family are, etc., you might find that slightly disconcerting. Equally, the people who are comfortable down here in the F and G category find that the top, the A, Bs and Cs, cold or not expressive. Culture shock is an issue to people and to companies, because in general it exacerbates existing problems. Anything that's already there can just be highlighted. Family issues, of course, can impinge on work performance. I know that a lot of companies are putting a lot of effort into making sure that the partners, the families, settle, so that part of the move works very well, that part of the mobility is good. And then in general, a lot of the work issues seem to correct themselves. Most people assume that the adjustment period is quite short. Most assumptions fall way below how long it actually takes. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that people who don't deal a lot with relocation and global mobility tend to assume that anyone who's on an expat package is earning something in the region of $1 million, of whichever currency you like, is flown home every 2 weeks first class, lives in a mansion with 3 servants, etc. Of course, an inflated view of what the reality is. And therefore there's the feeling that that is the compensation for whatever they're dealing with. Culture shock, of course, impinges on other relationships. It's something which can stop proper teams starting to build within the workplace, for example. And from that, it can affect the whole team or the division. I think the real danger is that when problems are misdiagnosed, and that when the problem is thought to be the person rather than it being a facet of culture shock, that somebody is perhaps not enthusiastic or not punctual or any of these things you've probably heard, and in fact it isn't a personal thing, it is all to do with this huge area of culture shock and settling in and really understanding the different cultures they're now dealing with. I've got another question, so you'll need your arrows again. Again, I'm not giving you massive context here because our time is limited. But imagine somebody asking you or asking somebody else and you're listening. This is the phrase they use. I wonder if you could look at the report and tell me what you think. Is that, to your mind, is that a request? Is it an order? Is it a someday maybe question? Meaning that it's, by someday maybe, I mean something that's not necessary to do. You're good with the arrows, thank you. And we're going heavily towards request. Okay, we could divide the world here. It's interesting. I think only 2 of you have come up to the order. Most people are there with the request, and nobody's down in the someday maybe Disneyland category. The someday maybe, this phrase to a lot of people from the United States means someday maybe, doesn't have much impact to them. A lot of people whose first language is German or Austrian, a lot of the Scandinavian languages, don't interpret this I wonder if you could as having some sort of fairly strong meaning, which obviously you've all shown by your arrows. Again, of course, context is important. Of course, the relationship between the 2 people who are speaking is important. But in my experience, these are the sort of phrases that are part of the whole culture shock experience because there's total misunderstanding. And if misunderstanding occurs when people are aware there's misunderstanding, it's not usually an issue. Whereas in this case, what tends to happen is that one person thinks they've very politely asked another person to do something. That's not been received in that way. And of course, this situation then continues. Another question I've got for you then, same thing, phrase, you might like to rethink your presentation. To you, and again, obviously it does depend who would say it, but in general, do you hear that as a vague suggestion? Do you hear it as an order? And by order, perhaps it should be in inverted commas there. Or do you hear it as a sarcastic remark? There's quite a good grouping here. Okay. All right. So again, as a group, you're coming in very nicely to the middle one more so. There's a few of you coming up. And of course, throughout, if we had a lot of different nationalities listening, we'd have much more of a spread with the arrows there, because to a lot of the world outside the United Kingdom, and of course that's where we are at the moment, that is nothing more than a vague suggestion. It doesn't have much weight at all. And of course, depending who says it, it can be pretty strong. I've got one more for you to ask. Same thing again. 2 people, one says to the other, finish this before you go home. Again, no context, but to you, is that a pleasant request, that kind of format? Is it an authoritative remark, excuse me, or is it an unreasonable command? Or is it a patronizing reminder? and we're all coming. There's a lot coming into it authoritative and. Okay, and again, I would say that depending on who says it and so on, it could be any of those. The difficulty is that if the person saying it means it as a pleasant request and it's interpreted as one of the others, or take any other combination of that. And again, in my experience, language plays such an enormous part in culture shock and what's happening, because most people assume that if they can speak a language, then they will understand absolutely everything. And of course, it's never quite as simple as that. So I suppose the big question that everyone asks all the time is, how do you recognise that there is a problem? Over the years, the way when I'm involved in training, and people are usually pretty positive, as they're adults, and they need to be, or they feel they need to be. How I know there is quite a significant problem is when I get the following question. Why don't you have mixer taps in the United Kingdom? Why are the taps separate in the United Kingdom? I can't tell you how many times I've been asked this question. I'm not a plumber. I've never had that experience, but this question comes up a lot. Now, of course, there is a response you can give that, of course, in the United Kingdom we're very brave, we're very strong, and we can deal with washing our face and hands in freezing water or scalding water. But I don't say that. The answer I usually give to the question about the mixer taps is, have you got a lot of challenges at work, or are you finding it difficult to socialise? The response I get then is, how did you know? Because in general, this sort of question is what is actually hiding something else. Meaning, it means I've not fitted in. I don't feel I'm doing things right, but I don't know how to change that. I don't feel I've got anyone to ask about this because I don't really know what I'm asking. So I think everybody needs, within the company, for anyone who has moved, anyone who is part of the global movement, to be able to recognise the mixer tap question and then perhaps do something about it. So within your organisation, how to handle culture shock. This is a massive subject, and of course it depends who you're dealing with and the situation. It's not an easy one-line answer. But I think there are a few things you can do. 5 key things to keep in mind. The first one, and I think sometimes the most important thing, is to look at language issues, because a lot of people don't differentiate between fluency and native or levels of comprehension, somebody who is bilingual. It depends very much how you've learnt the language you're speaking, if we stay with English for this, because English tends to be the language which is used so much. It depends how you've learnt it, and it depends at what age you started learning it, and the influence you've had. It's also worth remembering, and I often see this in people I'm dealing with from India. Sometimes they've been taught English by somebody who was taught English by somebody who learnt their English in the 1890s. It doesn't take long to get back to that. And there are quite interesting phrases that have obviously come through that way. So I think it's key to get the understanding that fluency doesn't mean that you automatically understand the nuances of the language and how we use it in a cultural way. If you think in the United Kingdom, how much of our language has come from humour, has come from theatre, television, and so on. I think adjust is the next point. The new arrival or arrivals, of course, are trying to settle in, to adjust, to change how they behave and do things. I think it needs to be constantly reiterated that this needs to be a two-way street. If everyone makes an effort, maybe we'll all meet at some middle point. Buddy system, a lot of companies use this. It's called different things. Buddy or buddies, somebody who can answer the mix-a-tap question. Someone who is perhaps away from the division or the department of the person and who can actually answer all these things in a fairly neutral way. Expectations is the next one. I think culture shock, the whole adjustment period, can last a lot longer than you would initially think. It's not a matter of weeks, it's not a matter just of a couple of months really. It can bubble on after that. And lastly, the L, local staff, really need to keep an eye on the fact of whether the issue, the problem, what is happening is personal or whether it is cultural, whether it is something that just has the cultural differences at the bottom of it all. I hope I've not gone too fast, and I hope that has given you something. And now I will hand back to Laura and Matthew for questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, firstly, a big thank you to Caroline for going through that session with us and giving us a great insight into culture shock and obviously what it means to our assignees who are going on or moving location. I think also as a result of that, it certainly stresses the importance around why we should be supporting the expatriate and assignee community. So thank you again, Caroline. In terms of what happens now, many of you, I appreciate, may be aware of Farnham Castle and our capability within the global mobility arena. We've got extensive experience in supporting both, I suppose really the global mobility subject from both expatriate perspectives, but also from a HR professional perspective as well. So if you would like to delve into this subject in greater detail, we do run a workshop called the Managing Expatriate Personnel Workshop, with the next dates coming up on the 12th and 13th of March. It's a 2-day residential course targeted at HR professionals specifically, so those of you who are responsible for supporting your expatriate community. And the purpose of the workshop is really to look at key themes and challenges in the management of expatriates and expatriation. So any of you who may be interested in finding out some more details around that workshop, we'd be more than happy to share information with you. And for those of you who have attended this webinar, we'd be happy to offer a 15% discount off the workshop. So in terms of materials following this session, what we will do is send you a copy of the slide deck. And obviously any of you who would like a recording of the webinar to share with any of your teams, you'd be very welcome to receive this. So my contact details are on the screen now, so hopefully you can see those. So you can either contact me via email or via telephone, and I'd be more than happy to share that information with you. Alternatively, if you just want to have an open conversation around how Farnham Castle intercultural training can support your business further, again, we'd be open to having those conversations with you and would welcome the opportunity. So I'd like to thank you all for joining, but what I will do now is hand over to Matthew McLachlan, who will now open the floor for any questions that have come up.
Okay, I can see that there are a couple of people I think who want to ask a couple of questions, and while you're thinking of your questions, I do have one for Caroline. Caroline, could you tell us, please, what the hardest country is you think for expatriates to go to?
You have to unmute me.
I think you are unmuted.
Oh, good. I've got a strange thing next to me. I don't know. That depends who you ask. I think nowadays the ones that are considered to be easy, sort of in the easy category, like Australia, are perhaps more difficult because there's not much sympathy or empathy given. It's assumed that you're going to be there on holiday for 2 years. So I think sometimes those are more difficult. Overall, I would say if you go somewhere and you have none of the local language, that throws up lots of challenges all on its own. You can feel very comfortable in a country if you know you can communicate. But I don't know what you'd think. I would hesitate to name only one country.
I think I'm probably with you actually. The countries that people think are easiest are actually probably the hardest because you're less prepared for them, perhaps. But,
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just going to ask a question and possibly embarrass one person. Kat Bitterly, you got a pointer on the screen. Is that because you want to ask a question or because you've misclicked on the screen? You are now unmuted.
Sorry, it was an accident. Sorry.
Don't worry at all. Don't worry at all. It's just I'd hate to ignore somebody before they had a question. I also have another question here from Katie. What initiatives have you seen that work in the most successfully in supporting individuals taking on an international assignment? So presumably you mean in terms of policies. Now, what initiatives or policies work the best, do you think, Caroline?
Is that, sorry, did you say Caroline, Matthew?
Yes, Caroline, yeah.
Yeah. I think, I suppose you'd say, I would say this, but I think they do need training before they go. They need language training even if they're going to be working in English, for example. I think language training for the country they're going to is vital to have before they go. Not necessarily to a very high level if they're not going to be using it much, but to have something. Because, of course, when you learn a language, you also learn so much about the history and the culture of where you're going to. In general, people will then go out and about much more. I think also having somebody that they're in touch with who they see as almost neutral. Now, I know this is difficult within an organisation, but somebody who they can be honest to, so that if they receive the email which say, how's it going, and you're in week 7, instead of giving the reply of, oh, everything's excellent, it's a really great opportunity for career development, they can to somebody say not great, and actually tell it like it is and not feel that they're moaning or whinging. That's quite difficult to set up in a company, to have that privacy, just that they know it's not then noted on their file. For goodness sake, don't send this person anywhere again, they moan or whatever. I don't know if that answers your question.
Let me unmic Katie and ask whether we've answered your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, hi, hello. It's actually Katie and Paula, there's 2 of us here.
Oh, right, hi there.
Yes, we were just interested in perhaps others' experiences in helping people to adjust. We've come across quite a few examples where the expectations of an expat assignment is meant to be glamorous and smooth, and it's very difficult to manage expectations around timelines, about making sure that people get the right information at the right time, because everybody wants to know it straight away, all the detail, all up front, because they've got lots of important decisions to make. And it's about, it would be useful to understand what people do to manage the information being fed at the right time, and that people aren't left not knowing or, and being told at the right time about things. What you said about the buddy is interesting, but whether there's other incentives or other practices that you see that also support somebody having their expectations managed and being prepared for things not going smoothly.
I think most people I've trained who've had issues and have got either irritated by them or in some cases furious, what they appreciate most of all is information flow. So if things aren't happening, if I don't know, there's a visa delay or there's an issue with housing or whatever it is, what they like most of all is just to know that it's happening, not just to be left in a black hole of no information. Because I think realistically most people know that in life things don't go smoothly. I think they just don't like being left. Does that help?
Caroline, I have to say, I've muted Katie's microphone. There was quite a lot of feedback on the line there. So,
oh, okay.
so she can't reply, I'm afraid. I think I mean, there aren't any more questions coming through, so I think probably we're going to end the session there. If people really do have burning questions, either stay around for another couple of minutes, or please do use Laura's contact details that are on the screen at the moment. We will be sending out a link with the recorded session on, so you'll be able to have a copy of the slides as well afterwards. Thank you very much once again for attending, and as I say, I will now allow people to sort of shout out and unmute everyone's microphones if you do want to ask further questions, but do feel free to leave without embarrassment if you now wish to do so. Thank you.